Have you ever felt hope drain from your bones like water through sand? Have you wondered what keeps a person moving when every muscle screams rest? And what happens to the soul when even God feels distant? In 1555, a 40-year-old woman sat in the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila, Spain. Her name was Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada. For 20 years, she had lived behind those walls. For 20 years, she had failed at prayer. She would kneel in her cell and count the minutes until she could leave. 1 hour felt like 10. She later wrote that she would have preferred any physical punishment to spending time alone with God. The distraction was unbearable, the silence was worse. But that year, something broke open. She saw a statue of the wounded Christ and felt her heart tear. Not gently, it tore like fabric. At 40 years old, Teresa finally understood what it meant to love something beyond yourself. At 40, she became a mystic. At 40, God showed her hell. If you value documented historical and spiritual content like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Teresa's own writings in the Book of Her Life, translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez through ICS Publications, considered the definitive scholarly edition of her complete works, and from extensive biographical documentation compiled by Reverend Benedict Zimmerman in The Life of Saint Teresa of Jesus, published by the Order of Our Lady of Carmel in 1916. Now back to the information. The vision came during prayer. One moment, Teresa was kneeling in her cell. The next moment, she was standing in hell. She did not know how. She did not choose to go. God simply put her there. The entrance looked like a long, narrow alley, like a furnace. Low ceiling, dark, confined. The floor was covered in mud that stank of rot. Vermin crawled everywhere. At the end of the alley was a hole carved into the wall, a cupboard. She was shoved inside. The walls closed in. She could not sit. She could not lie down. No room. The walls themselves looked alive and terrifying. They suffocated everything. Total darkness. But somehow she could still see what needed to be seen, what caused pain. Teresa tried to describe the fire she felt. She had suffered physical illness for years. At 25, she fell into a coma so deep they dug her grave. She woke 4 days later, paralyzed for 3 years. The nerves in her body shrank and twisted. Doctors called it the worst suffering possible. But hell was worse. The fire in hell was not on her skin. It was inside, in the soul itself. The soul was tearing itself apart, not being torn by someone else, doing it to itself. Fire and despair. Interior, fire and despair. She wrote those words twice in her account. The worst was that interior fire and despair. She could not describe it. No words were sufficient. The anguish of the soul, the oppression, the suffocation, the pain so keen accompanied by such hopeless and cruel infliction. Utterly without the power to hope for any consolation. That phrase matters, utterly without the power to hope. In hell, hope does not exist, not even the memory of hope. Teresa saw that the punishment was not the fire or the walls or the darkness. The punishment was the complete absence of hope, the certainty that nothing would ever change. No relief, no end, no rescue. Forever. The vision lasted seconds. But she said even if she lived 1,000 years, she would never forget it. When she wrote about it later, she felt the same bone-chilling terror run through her body again. The memory alone was enough to paralyze her with fear. But the vision did something unexpected. It gave her purpose. Teresa left that prayer knowing exactly what she had to do. She had seen where souls go when hope dies. She had felt what happens when people give up. And she decided she would spend the rest of her life pulling people back from that edge. She would reform the Carmelite order. She would return it to prayer, to poverty, to the simple life that the first Carmelites lived on Mount Carmel centuries before. No more comfort, no more socializing, no more pretending, just prayer, just God, just hope. In 1562, at 47 years old, Teresa founded her first Reformed convent. She called it St. Joseph's. The town of Avila erupted, citizens rioted, religious authorities sued her. Her own sisters at the convent of the Incarnation turned against her. They said she was arrogant. They said she was deluded. They said she should focus on raising money for their convent instead of starting her own. The Spanish Inquisition threatened her, but she had seen hell. She had felt the absence of hope. Compared to that, human opposition was nothing. The convent started with 4 women. 4. They lived in absolute poverty, no endowments, no wealthy patrons paying for comfort. They survived on public alms. They wore sandals instead of shoes. This became their identity. Discalced, unshod, barefoot, a symbol of poverty and humility. They prayed for hours. They lived in strict enclosure. No social visits, no parties in town, just the interior life, just the slow work of becoming holy. For months, the resistance was brutal. Then it subsided. The Bishop of Avila, Don Alvaro de Mendoza, gave his support. In 1567, the Carmelite Prior General from Rome, John Baptist Rossi, came to Avila and approved the reform. He told Teresa to found more convents and to establish monasteries for men. The work exploded. Between 1567 and 1582, Teresa founded 17 convents across Spain. She traveled thousands of miles. She met John Yepes in Medina del Campo in 1567. He became her closest ally. The world knows him as St. John of the Cross. Together, they founded the first monastery for men at Duruelo in November 1568. But the cost was staggering. Teresa's health never recovered from her early illnesses. Her body was broken. She suffered chronic pain, bleeding, exhaustion. She traveled on rough Spanish roads in carts that shook her bones apart. She crossed mountains. She forded rivers in flood. Once, standing in a river torrent with water up to her waist, she cried out to God, "Lord, amid so many ills, this comes on top of all the rest." A voice answered her. "Teresa, that is how I treat my friends." She shot back, "Ah, my God, that is why you have so few of them." That exchange tells you everything about Teresa. She loved God with her whole heart, but she was not gentle about it. She was blunt, honest, frustrated, tired, so tired. In her later writings, she confessed that there were days when a single word distressed her, days when she wanted to leave the world because everything felt like a burden. She talked openly about her failing health, her memory loss, her inability to do what was asked of her, her shortcomings as a writer. She did not hide her weakness. She wrote about it plainly, like someone at the end of their strength, still moving forward because stopping was not an option. In 1575, the jurisdictional dispute began. The old Carmelites, the ones who followed the relaxed rule, resented Teresa's reforms. They called her movement divisive, dangerous. The Carmelite general ordered her to retire to a convent in Castile to stop founding new houses. John of the Cross was imprisoned in Toledo in 1577. For months he was locked in a cell barely larger than a closet. He was beaten, starved. He escaped by climbing out a window and lowering himself on knotted blankets. When he reached the ground, he was skeletal, broken, but alive. Teresa fought back through letters. She wrote to King Philip II of Spain. She explained her reforms. She defended her work. She begged for protection. In 1579, the charges against her and John of the Cross were dropped. In 1580, Pope Gregory XIII issued a rescript. The Discalced Carmelites were recognized as a separate province, independent, autonomous, free to continue the reform. Teresa had won, but she was shattered. By 1580, Teresa was 65 years old. Her body was failing. She could barely walk. Every journey was agony, but the bishops kept asking her to found more convents, to reform existing monasteries. She could not say no. In 1580, she founded convents at Villanueva de la Jara and Palencia. In 1581, she founded one at Soria. In 1582, she founded her last two. Granada, Burgos. Burgos nearly killed her. She arrived in January 1582. The foundation was completed in April. She wrote the final chapter of her book, The Foundations, in July. Then she left Burgos to return to Avila. She was ordered to stop in Alba de Tormes to visit the Duchess of Alba. The Duchess was pregnant. There were complications. Teresa was summoned to attend the birth, even though she was desperately ill. She obeyed. She traveled from Burgos through Palencia, through Valladolid, through Medina del Campo. At Valladolid, she became dangerously ill and had to rest for days. She finally reached Alba de Tormes on September 20th, 1582. The baby had already been born by the time she arrived. Healthy, the Duchess did not need her. But Teresa was too weak to travel further. She stayed at the convent in Alba. Her body was shutting down, bleeding, fever, pain in every joint. She could not eat. She could barely speak. On October 4th, 1582, she asked for the last rites. She received communion. She whispered verses from the Song of Songs. Then she said her last words, "My Lord, it is time to move on." "Well then, may your will be done. O Lord and my spouse, the hour that I have longed for has come. It is time to meet one another." She died just after midnight, October 4th by the old Julian calendar, but Catholic Europe was switching to the Gregorian calendar that very week. The dates, October 5th through 14th, were deleted from the calendar to correct the drift. So Teresa died on October 4th, but by the new calendar, it was October 15th. That is why her feast day is October 15th. She died in the gap between calendars, disappeared into the space where time itself was being corrected. 9 months later, they opened her coffin. The body was intact. The clothing had rotted, but the flesh had not. They cut off her left hand, wrapped it in a scarf, and sent it to Avila. Later, they moved the entire body back to Avila. The Duke of Alba de Tormes was furious. He brought the body back. Pope Sixtus V ordered it to remain in Alba de Tormes under pain of excommunication. That is where it rests today. Pieces of Teresa scattered across Spain, a hand here, an arm there, relics for the faithful. Her body divided just like her life, pulled in every direction, never at rest. But the thing people miss about Teresa is this. She was not a saint because she saw visions. She was a saint because she kept moving when hope grew tired. The visions came and went. God appeared and disappeared. There were years when Teresa felt nothing, when prayer was dry, when God was silent, when every step felt like dragging weight through mud. But she did not stop. She founded convents when she could barely stand. She wrote books when her hands shook. She traveled when every bone in her body begged for rest. She obeyed orders she thought were foolish. She submitted to superiors who misunderstood her. She let herself be investigated, questioned, doubted, mocked, and she kept going. Why? Because she had seen what happens when hope dies. She had been to the place where despair is total, where the soul tears itself apart, where there is no light, no comfort, no possibility of change. She had felt that. And she came back, and she decided that no one else should have to stay there. That was her mission. Not to have visions, not to levitate during Mass, not to receive the stigmata. Her mission was to give people a reason to hope, a place to pray, a community that lived as if God was real, as if eternity mattered, as if this life was preparation for something greater. Let me give you the second call to action now. If you value content like this that goes deep into historical and spiritual documentation, subscribe. Comment where you're watching from. This is researched using primary sources, specifically the critical translations from ICS publications and the scholarly, editions compiled by the Order of Our Lady of Carmel, which preserved Teresa's original voice without sanitizing her struggles. Now back to the story. In 1558, 3 years after her conversion experience, Teresa wrote about her vision of hell in detail. She was ordered to write it by her spiritual directors. They needed to know if her experiences were from God or from the devil. In 16th century Spain, that question could mean life or death. The Inquisition burned people for less, but Teresa wrote honestly. She described the vision exactly as it happened. She did not soften it. She did not make it palatable. She said the entrance to hell looked like a furnace. The floor was mud full of worms. The walls closed in. The fire was interior. The despair was total. She said she would endure 1,000 deaths to save one soul from that place. That line is the key. She would endure 1,000 deaths because she knew what one death felt like. She had been paralyzed. She had been in a coma. She had suffered chronic illness for 40 years. She knew physical death. And she said she would take that 1,000 times over rather than let someone experience the spiritual death she had seen in hell. That is the depth of her compassion. That is why she spent 20 years dragging her broken body across Spain. Not because she was a hero, because she had seen the alternative. But here is what makes Teresa different from other mystics. She did not just see heaven and hell. She lived in the middle, in the exhaustion, in the doubt, in the days when God felt absent. She wrote about those days as honestly as she wrote about the visions. She said there were times when she did not want to pray, when she resented the call, when she looked at the road ahead and wanted to quit. She was human, fully human, and she let that humanity show. Consider her early years. Teresa was born March 28, 1515, in Avila, daughter of Don Alfonso Sanchez de Cepeda and Dona Beatriz Davila Yahumada, third child, 9 siblings total, wealthy family. Her grandfather on her father's side was Jewish, a converso, someone who had converted to Christianity to escape persecution. The family carried that secret, that stain. In Spain in 1515, Jewish blood meant suspicion, investigation, exclusion. Teresa grew up knowing she was other, that she had to prove herself, that her faith would always be questioned. At 7 years old, she convinced her brother Rodrigo to run away with her. They were going to Africa, to the land of the Moors, to be martyred, to die for Christ. Her uncle found them on the road out of town, brought them back. Her parents were horrified, but Teresa was not punished. She was admired. People said she had the heart of a saint, but the truth was more complicated. She wanted to die young because she wanted to see God. She did not want to wait. She did not want to endure the long, slow work of holiness. She wanted the shortcut, the dramatic ending, the glory without the struggle. When her mother died in 1529, Teresa was 14. The loss broke her. She turned to the Virgin Mary as her new mother, but she also turned to frivolity, to clothes, to romance novels, to flirting with boys, to rebellion against her father's strict rules. She became, in her own words, worldly. At 16, her father sent her to live with Augustinian nuns, a boarding school for troubled girls. She hated it at first. But slowly the nuns won her over. She began to think about religious life, not from devotion, from practicality. Marriage meant obedience to a husband, childbirth, domestic life. The convent offered more freedom, more intellectual stimulation, more control over her own destiny. At 20, she left her father's house without permission, entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation. Her father relented. He even became a benefactor. Teresa was professed in 1536, and then she got sick, terribly sick, seizures, convulsions. The nuns thought she was possessed or dying, or both. In 1538, she fell into a coma, 4 days. They dug her grave. prepared her body for burial, but she woke, paralyzed. For 3 years she could not move her legs, could not walk. The doctor said the nerves had shrunk, that the pain would never fully leave. They were right. For the rest of her life, Teresa lived with chronic pain, with illness that came and went without warning, with a body that betrayed her constantly. During those years of paralysis, she learned to pray. Sort of. She tried. She read books about contemplative prayer, about recollection, about quieting the mind and resting in God. But she was terrible at it. Her mind wandered. She counted the minutes. She made excuses. When she recovered and could walk again, she stopped praying altogether. For 15 years, from age 25 to age 40, she attended the required communal prayers. But personal prayer? Mental prayer? She abandoned it. She blamed her illness, her distractions, her unworthiness. She told herself she was too great a sinner, that God would rather bless people who deserved it, that she was wasting his time. But the truth was simpler. She did not want to face herself. Prayer requires honesty, silence, confrontation with who you really are. And Teresa did not like what she saw. She was vain, ambitious, hungry for approval. She loved entertaining visitors in the parlor, loved gossip, loved being the center of attention. The convent of the Incarnation was not strict. Women came and went. They had servants, jewelry, nice clothes. It was more like a social club than a monastery. And Teresa thrived in that environment. She was charming, witty, beautiful. Everyone wanted to be near her. She was the life of the party. And she loved it. Until she was 40, until she saw the statue, until something in her heart broke and she could not pretend anymore. The statue showed Christ wounded, bloody, suffering. And Teresa realized she had never actually looked at him. She had been a nun for 20 years, but she had never seen Jesus, not really. She had seen the rituals, the rules, the social benefits, but she had never looked at the man dying on the cross and asked herself what he was dying for. When she finally asked that question, everything changed. The visions started, the interior fire, the sense of God's presence so strong she could not ignore it. Her confessors did not know what to make of it. Some said it was God, others said it was the devil. The Spanish Inquisition opened an investigation. Teresa was terrified. She knew what happened to people the Inquisition suspected. They disappeared. They burned. In 1577, the worst year of the persecution, when John of the Cross was imprisoned and Teresa was ordered to stop her work, she wrote a letter to her friend Maria de San Jose. She said she felt abandoned, alone, misunderstood. She said the weight of the reform was crushing her. She said she did not know if she could continue. But then she wrote something else. She said that even in the darkness, even when she could not feel God's presence, she knew he was there. She knew because she had seen hell. And this was not hell. This was suffering. But it was not despair. Suffering ends. Despair does not. That distinction saved her. Suffering has an end. You can endure suffering if you believe it will stop. But despair has no end. Despair is the belief that nothing will ever change, that you are trapped forever. That is hell. Teresa had seen it. She had felt it. And she carried that knowledge with her every day. When she was sick, she remembered hell. When she was tired, she remembered hell. When she wanted to quit, she remembered hell. And she decided that her temporary suffering was nothing compared to the eternal suffering she had witnessed. In 1582, the year she died, Teresa wrote the final section of her book, The Interior Castle. It is her masterpiece. In it, she describes the soul as a castle made of diamond or crystal, 7 mansions inside, 7 stages of prayer, 7 movements toward God. The first mansion is the entry, the soul barely aware of God's presence. The 7th mansion is union, the soul so close to God that it cannot tell where it ends and he begins. But between the 1st and the 7th are 5 other mansions, 5 stages of struggle, of dryness, of doubt, of darkness. Teresa spent most of her time in those middle mansions, not in ecstasy, in effort. She wrote that most people never make it past the 3rd mansion. They try, they pray, they desire God, but the cost is too high. The dryness lasts too long. They give up. They go back to the 1st mansion, or they leave the castle entirely. Teresa understood that. She had lived in the 3rd mansion for 15 years, from age 20 to age 40, praying without feeling anything, wanting God but not wanting the discipline, loving the idea of holiness but not the reality. It was only after her conversion at 40 that she moved deeper, and even then it was not easy. Even then there were days when she wanted to turn back. But here is the thing people forget. Teresa did not wait until she reached the 7th mansion to start her reform. She did not wait until she was perfect. She started at 47, still struggling, still sick, still unsure. She founded St. Joseph's while she was in the middle of her own spiritual journey. She did not have all the answers. She just had the vision of hell and the memory of what it felt like to live without hope. And she decided that was enough. She would build a place where people could hope, where they could pray, where they could struggle together. She did not promise them ecstasy. She promised them community. The convents she founded were small, 12 to 15 women maximum. That was intentional. She wanted them to know each other, to live as family. She rejected the hierarchies of wealth. Rich women and poor women lived side by side. No special treatment, no privileges. She also accepted conversos, women of Jewish ancestry. In 15th-16th century Spain, that was dangerous. The purity of blood laws were strict. People were investigated, excluded, persecuted. But Teresa's own family was converso. Her grandfather was Jewish. She knew what it meant to be suspect. So she opened her doors. She refused to investigate bloodlines. She said God did not care about ancestry, only about the soul. That decision made enemies. But Teresa did not care. She had been to hell. She knew what mattered. Blood did not matter. Money did not matter. Status did not matter. What mattered was whether you could kneel in silence and face yourself, whether you could sit with God when he felt absent, whether you could hope when hope felt foolish. That was the test, not your family name, not your dowry. Your willingness to stay in the third mansion when everything in you wanted to leave. In 1571, Teresa was appointed prioress of the Convent of the Incarnation, her old convent. The place where she had lived for 20 years in lukewarm spirituality. Now she was in charge. The sisters did not want her. They had voted for someone else, but the authorities overruled them. They needed Teresa to reform the convent, to bring discipline, to restore prayer. Teresa obeyed. She returned to the place where she had failed for so long, and she began the slow work of change. It was brutal. The sisters resented her. They gossiped. They complained. They refused to follow the new rules. Teresa endured it. She did not force them. She did not punish them. She just kept praying, kept teaching, kept showing up. Slowly, over months, the convent changed. Not because Teresa was charismatic, because she was present. She lived what she taught. She prayed when she did not feel like praying. She fasted when she was hungry. She served when she was tired. The sisters saw that. And some of them started to follow. John of the Cross was the chaplain at the Incarnation during those years. He and Teresa worked together. They talked about prayer, about suffering, about the dark night of the soul. John was writing his poetry, the spiritual canticle, the dark night, the living flame of love. Teresa was writing the interior castle. They were creating the framework for Carmelite spirituality, not from theory, from experience. From the middle mansions, from the places where God felt absent and the soul had to choose. Hope or despair. Keep moving or give up. In 1575, Teresa left the Incarnation and went to Seville to found a convent. It was one of the hardest foundations. The heat was unbearable. The building was falling apart. The local authorities were hostile. Teresa became ill. She thought she might die there, but she did not. She stayed until the convent was stable. Then she moved on, because that was her pattern. Found a convent, established the community, trained the prioress, leave, move to the next town, start again. People asked her how she did it, how she kept going. She said she did not know. She said it was grace. But when you read her letters, you see something else. You see stubbornness. You see refusal. You see a woman who decided that giving up was not an option. Not because she was strong, because the alternative was too terrible. She had seen what happens when people stop hoping. She would not let that happen to her, or to anyone under her care. In 1581, at 66 years old, Teresa wrote a letter to a young prioress who was discouraged. The convent was struggling. The sisters were fighting. The prioress wanted to quit. Teresa wrote back. She said this: "Do not be surprised that it is hard. Do not expect it to be easy. This is the work. The struggle is the work. If it were easy, everyone would do it. But it is not easy. It is brutally hard. And that is why it matters. Because you are learning to hope when there is no reason to hope. You are learning to love when there is no reward. You are learning to pray when God is silent. That is what makes you holy. Not the visions, the effort." That letter contains Teresa's entire spirituality in one paragraph. Holiness is effort, not ecstasy. Effort. The daily decision to keep going, to keep praying, to keep hoping, even when you do not feel anything, even when God seems absent, even when your body is broken and your mind is tired and every part of you wants to quit. You do not quit. That is holiness. Showing up when it costs you everything to show up. In the last months of her life, Teresa could barely move. Her body was failing. She was bleeding internally, fever, pain, weakness. But she kept writing, she kept working, she kept praying. She wrote letters to her convents. She gave advice to young nuns. She planned future foundations. She did not stop, even when stopping would have been merciful. She did not stop because she had not finished. There were still souls who needed hope. Still people standing at the edge of despair. And as long as she could breathe, she would reach for them. On October 4th, 1582, Teresa could no longer breathe. Her lungs filled. Her heart slowed. She asked for the sacraments. She received communion one last time. She looked at the sisters gathered around her bed. She smiled. She said, "I am a daughter of the church. Then she closed her eyes. And she went to meet the God she had loved so imperfectly, so humanly, so completely. The sisters said that in the moment of her death, the room filled with light. Some said they smelled roses. Others said they heard singing. But those are the stories people tell. What matters is this. Teresa died exhausted. She died in pain. She died in the middle of her work. She did not finish everything she wanted to finish. She did not found all the convents she had planned. She did not write all the books she intended to write. She died incomplete, unfinished. Like most of us will die. But she died hoping. She died believing. She died with her eyes fixed on something beyond this life. She had seen hell. She had seen where despair leads, and she refused to go there. She chose hope. Every day, every hour, every breath, she chose hope. Not because it was easy. Because the alternative was unbearable. That is her legacy. Not the visions, not the levitations, not the miracles. The daily decision to hope when hope made no sense. To keep moving when her body begged for rest. To keep praying when God felt silent. That is what made her a saint. In 1585, 3 years after her death, they exhumed her body. It was intact, incorrupt. The clothes had rotted, but the flesh had not. They removed an arm and left it in Alba de Tormes as a relic. The rest of the body was taken to Avila, but the Duke of Alba demanded it back. There were legal battles, papal decrees. Finally, Pope Sixtus V ordered that the body remain in Alba de Tormes. He threatened excommunication for anyone who moved it again, so it stayed. Teresa's body split between two cities. Her relics scattered across Spain. Her influence spread across the world. In 1622, 40 years after her death, Pope Gregory XV canonized her. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a doctor of the Church, the first woman ever given that title, not because she was perfect, because she was honest, because she wrote about the struggle, because she admitted when she failed, because she showed that holiness is not about never falling. It is about getting up every time you fall. It is about choosing hope when hope feels impossible. Today, her writings are studied in universities. Her convents still exist. The Discalced Carmelites are a global order. Thousands of men and women live under the rule Teresa wrote. They pray in silence, they live in poverty. They dedicate their lives to the interior castle, to the journey through the 7 mansions, to the slow work of becoming holy. And they do it because Teresa showed them it was possible. Not easy, possible. In the interior castle, Teresa wrote that God does not ask us to do the impossible. He asks us to do what seems impossible. To love when we do not feel love, to pray when we do not feel God, to hope when we have no reason to hope. He asks us to show up, to be present, to stay in the castle even when we want to leave. And if we do that, if we just keep showing up, he will meet us. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. In the 7th mansion, or in the next life, or in the moment of death when all the struggle finally makes sense. Teresa saw hell. She saw the place where hope dies. And she came back. And she spent the rest of her life building places where hope could live. Small communities of women praying together, writing books for people who struggled, traveling across Spain when her body could barely stand. She gave everything, not because she was a hero, because she knew what was at stake. She knew that despair was real, that hell was real, that giving up had consequences that lasted forever. So she did not give up. She kept moving until her body gave out, until there was nothing left to give, until she could finally say, "My Lord, it is time to move on." And here's the final piece that most people miss. In 1629, 47 years after Teresa died, a Spanish Carmelite named Jerome Gratian wrote his memoirs. Gratian had been Teresa's closest friend, her spiritual advisor, her ally in the Reform. He had fought beside her for years. He had been imprisoned, persecuted, exiled. He lost everything, but he survived. And in his memoirs, he wrote about a conversation he had with Teresa in 1579, 3 years before she died. They were walking in the cloister at Avila. Teresa was 64, sick, exhausted. The persecution was ending, but the damage was done. John of the Cross was broken. Several nuns had died. The reform had cost more than anyone imagined. Gratian asked Teresa if it was worth it, if she would do it again, knowing what it would cost. Teresa stopped walking. She looked at him. She said this, "I would do it 100 times over, because I have seen hell. I have seen where souls go when they lose hope. And if I can save even one person from that place, then everything I have suffered is nothing. 100 years of suffering would be nothing, because eternity is real, and hope is the only thing that stands between us and the abyss." Gratian wrote that he never forgot those words, that they stayed with him through his own exile, through the years when the Chalcid Carmelites hunted him, through the shipwreck that nearly killed him, through the months he spent as a slave to Barbary pirates. Hope is the only thing that stands between us and the abyss. Teresa saw the abyss. She stood at the edge and looked in, and then she turned around and spent her life pulling people back. Not with words, with her life, with her body, with her refusal to give up even when giving up would have been easier. That is what makes her story matter. Not that she was extraordinary, that she was human, fully human, and she showed that humans can choose hope even when hope grows tired. Even when the body fails, even when God feels absent, even when everything says quit. You can choose hope. You can keep moving. You can reach the seventh mansion, or you can die trying. And either way, you will have lived.